lecture, I would like us to rethink diaspora and understand their role in the global world. Let's first look at the definition. What is a diaspora? Robin Cohen identifies key characteristics of diaspora. This is on your screen, but I'll flag up a few points. So, for example, he says that they are involved in dispersal from an original homeland, often traumatically, to two or more foreign regions, or there's an expansion from one homeland in search of work, trade, or colonial ambitions. Collective memory and myths about homeland, including its location, history, achievements, and idealization of the putative ancestral home, and a collective commitment to its maintenance, restoration, safety, and prosperity, even to its creation. He also talks about how there is kind of a return movement, and that there is also a strong ethnic group consciousness sustained over a long time. And at times, a troubled relationship with host societies, a sense of empathy and solidarity with co-ethnics in other countries, and also the possibility of a distinctive yet creative, enriching life in host countries with a tolerance for pluralism. So these are some of the key characteristics that are identified by Robin Cohen. Now, how can we further extend understandings of diaspora? So in this lecture, I would like to examine our understanding of diaspora as the field of diaspora studies, despite its transnational promise, has too often got trapped in methodologically nationalist perspectives. In other words, it has trapped discussions of diaspora to nation-centric understandings, vocabularies, and discourses. Methodologically nationalist approaches to diaspora typically see diaspora as emerging out of ethnopolitical struggles within nation states, viewed from the perspective of push factors, so as something happening within a nation state, and therefore people have to move. And this has happened despite many diaspora theorists, for example, Avtar Brah, Robin Cohen, Paul Gilroy, Stuart Hall, and others having discussed diaspora within the context of empire. Methodologically nationalist approaches to diaspora, however, have brought spatial and temporal limitations to our understandings. They have brought temporal limitations as the link between empire and diaspora have been erased. So it has brought historical limitations. It has also brought spatial limitations as the transnational reach of diaspora has ironically been curbed. So it has brought geographical limitations. Let me take them up simultaneously. Empires have governed various populations, myriad ethnic, religious, and cultural groups. Through plantations, indenture, colonization, expansion, settlements, slavery, and other forms of domination and movements of peoples, empires have been instigators of diasporas. Many of today's diasporas were made in and by recent empires, including the collapse of them and or the nationalist projects that followed them. So think about the Ottoman Empire. We have Kurdish and Armenian diasporas. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Slavic and Jewish diasporas. The British Empire, Afro-Caribbean and South Asian diasporas. Or the French Empire, Arab and African diasporas. Many of today's diasporas are thus an outcome of historic relationships arising out of subordination and colonization, of expansion and retraction of empires. Yet diaspora research has often ended up being too tightly hemmed into the history, sources, and understandings of the nation state. I argue that diaspora should instead be understood as inscribed and entangled in a series of historical and political processes associated with empire and expansion, including, of course, nationalist and ethnopolitical responses to these. Ethnopolitical struggles and diasporization, that is, their spilling to other places, are a post-colonial phenomena. Even if we take an example like the Kurdish diaspora, it is typically constructed within nation-centric discourses. Yet it is not possible to understand Kurds and the Kurdish diaspora without an awareness of the role of Ottoman, French, and British empires and their reorganization of the borders and consolidation of populations and religious and ethnic allegiances in the Middle East. Nor can a perspective that ignores empire identify or unpack the Kurdish, indigenous, and decolonial discourses arising in diaspora. So these are approaches we can use, approaches I utilize, if we decouple diaspora from methodological nationalism, as I'm suggesting. Hence, we need to question the limitations which have hemmed in diaspora research both spatially and temporally. Confining discussions of diaspora to the politics of their nation-state also places on boundaries on diaspora's citizenship in the new home, leaving a question mark over the extent to which they can really belong. It continues to reproduce the assumption that the real home of diasporas remains elsewhere, that is their nation-state, with the consequence that their citizenship in the new home is regarded as contingent and revocable, even when there are centuries of linkages and lineages that were created through empire. We can think of course, the recent Windrush scandal, how those from the Windrush generation in Britain were regarded as immigrants, despite the fact that they or their parents had come to the mother country as Commonwealth citizens, as British subjects. So leaving the relationship between empire and diaspora unacknowledged and unexplored can mean that even those diasporas that have extremely close historical and cultural links with the metropole can continue to be construed as another, and their presence questioned and then being sent back to, quote, their nation state. Diaspora research, which ignores the colonial and empire access of diasporas, reproduce North-centric understandings of migration, diasporas, and ethnic diversity. For example, they act as a justification for hard, violent borders of the global north. Here, of course, I have in mind those refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, English Channel, or violence at the US-Mexico border or Belarus-Polish border more recently. Such understandings also reinforce the view that diversity is something that happened to the global north recently. This is because they ignore that cultural plurality has been woven into the fabric of the global north due to colonialism and empires. In order to challenge such amnesia, when post-colonial diasporas in Britain were faced with go home signs in Britain in the 60s, they used the motto, "We are here because you are there," making a spatial link between UK and elsewhere and a temporal link between the configuration of UK's today and its history. This is, of course, not unique to the UK. The indigene movement in France has also been doing the same. I have the full name in the next slide. Thirdly, such North-centric understandings of diaspora are often unable to see others, for example, the colonized or racialized diasporas, as sources and originators of ideas and concepts. They fail to recognize that racialized diasporas in the global north, through their struggles, have conceptually and practically expanded ideas about equality and freedom in fundamental ways through their interventions and challenges to the global north. Diasporas in Europe, for example, have fought against discrimination, poor conditions, unequal treatment. They have challenged racist practices and laws, and have demanded non-discrimination, equality, and dignity. The anti-slavery movements, rebellions, and emancipation demands in the colonies did this. This is also a struggle their children, as part of the global south in the global north, have and are still carrying on, expanding our understandings of equality, rights, and freedom. You can think of, for example, Bristol bus boycott of 1963, the Grunwick dispute, this time it was the women in saris that led the rebellions, the indigene movement in France, Black Lives Matter movement, or think about the Kick Out Piet movement in the Netherlands. These are all examples of how diasporas have and are expanding understandings of liberty, equality, and dignity. Us challenging such North-centric understandings of migration, diasporas, and ethnic diversity is therefore central. I argue that diaspora research needs to move away from methodologically nationalist discourses, which reduce diasporas to their homeland politics, and instead make central how diasporas have intellectually and practically expanded ideas about equality and freedom. That is, see them as instigators of ideas about freedom and equality and dignity, and not purely of receivers. Secondly, I argue that we need to construe diasporas as authors, as makers of modernity and our globalized world, instead of merely an outcome of globalization or of modernity. Thirdly, we need to push back not only against methodologically nationalist discourses of diaspora, which trap diasporas permanently in their homelands, but also challenge those discourses which trap them somewhere in between homeland and the host, purely in discourses of hybridity or the tyranny of in-betweenness. Fourthly, I argue that we see that diasporas not only have their roots in empires, but they also throw up issues in the metropole, in the global north, as they seek to undo racialized hierarchies that were entrenched through empire and slavery. They are thus primary agents of decolonization of the global north.